Welcome everyone to the Chess Angle. I'll be flying solo this week. We had a couple of great interview episodes the past few weeks, but it'll be just me this week, and I'm going to be discussing a bit of chess psychology with the new tournament player in mind, a little bit of the mindset approach to the game. We'll be getting into that, but first, let's go to our listener mailbag and hear what you had to say.
You've got mail.
Our first email is from Matthew in the UK. He writes, "Dear Neal, great work with the podcast where I'm listening over in the UK. I've only discovered it recently and have now got about 40 episodes in and am really enjoying the content. I'm a secondary school music teacher, ages 11 to 16 in the UK, where I run a chess club at the school and also help out at a local chess club with a growing junior section. So I was intrigued to hear that you are also a music teacher and prompted this question about memory and recall. As a musician, I am able to play from memory for a full gig on the keyboard, yet when I'm playing chess, I sometimes struggle to memorize lines past just a few moves. I've even considered writing songs with lyrics to help me remember main lines, but without much success. There are clear links between maths and chess, and there are often links between maths and music. So I'm interested on your view if there is any potential link between chess and music." Well, thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate it. There's definitely a link between chess and music. There's a lot of connections, and we actually have a lot of musicians who listen to this podcast on a regular basis. We also have a number of musicians at the club, not necessarily full-time musicians, but they're involved in music in some way. They either sing or play an instrument, very common. The great Russian chess player Mark Taimanov, he was a piano virtuoso. He comes to mind. There are many others. The great French player Philidor was another one. He was a composer. A lot of chess players who are musicians, so you're not alone. Now, one thing, Matthew, when you talk about memorization and having trouble memorizing, just be careful. You want to understand the themes and the ideas and the plans of the opening. That's how you'll really transfer it over the board in a realistic way, because if you're just focusing on memorizing lines, if your opponent goes off book or plays something other than the expected move, then you have to think on your own. And if you understand the plans, you're going to be able to do that. So just be careful that your opening study isn't all memorization. And if you are doing opening lines or opening choices where memorization is a big part of it, where it's very move order dependent, you just may want to watch out for that, because then you're going to just be in this lifetime cycle of opening theory. So basically, it's more important that you understand the themes and ideas of the opening rather than just memorizing moves. Because what a lot of players do, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but what a lot of players do is they get into the theory and memorizing the lines and the moves, but they don't really understand what they're playing. They're just playing it because they memorized it. And it's sort of like, I think back to certain subjects in school when I was younger, where you would memorize certain facts and terms and definitions for a test, and you would write it down for the test, but you really didn't understand what it means. You were just able to sort of recite the definition, that type of thing. So again, really understand the themes and the ideas and what your goals are, rather than just memorizing individual moves, because that's not something you really want to be spending a lot of time on as you're developing as a player. You want to work on strategy and tactics and your end game technique and all those other things. And you don't just want to rely on memorizing openings to get you through it. Again, I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, but that's a trap that you can easily fall into. So keep that in mind. Now, as far as music and chess, I could probably do a whole episode on this, but I'll say this. For me, a chess game is like an improvised jazz solo. Because when you're a jazz musician, yes, you're improvising, but you have to do that within context. A lot of non-musicians think that jazz players just kind of play whatever they want. That's not true. You have to do so within the context of the chords and the keys and all that stuff. But think about what a jazz musician does. He has certain theory that he relies on, scales, chords, and melodies, all these different things. certain patterns might be learned ahead of time, but ultimately, what is a jazz musician doing? You're learning all the theory, learning everything about your instrument, and then you are creating, you're extracting melodies from that. I remember the great Jimmy Heath, the great saxophone player, when I was at Queens College many, many years ago, getting my master's degree. I had the privilege of playing in the jazz band there under his direction. And he used to say jazz improvisation is just learning all your theory, all your scales and chords, and extracting melodies from them. And that's sort of what a chess game is, right? You're learning all your theory, your openings, your middle game strategy, your end game theory, but ultimately you're using those rules to create on your own. Billy Mitchell, the great jazz saxophonist, tenor saxophone player, he played with the Count Basie band. He lived on Long Island, I believe. There was an old jazz club here on Long Island called Sonny's Place. Those of you who have been around as long as I have and who live on Long Island know what I'm talking about. I think it was in Seaford, but he would perform there occasionally. And he had a great saying as well. I believe it was Billy Mitchell who said this, which is to become a strong jazz musician, you have to spend 5 years learning everything and then the rest of your life forgetting about it. And I think that's true with chess in a way. You have to learn all your theory, all your quote unquote rules, and then you just have to apply it and just play. And I really think that's what it is. It's a mix of theory and creativity, because what is an improvised jazz solo? You kind of, in a way, you're sort of jumping off a cliff and figuring out how you're going to land later. And a chess game is like that as well. And let's face it, regardless of how much you study and how much theory, essentially you're going to be on your own at some point during the game. And the same is true with an improvised jazz solo. So I really think, for me, as far as music and chess, that would be the ultimate analogy. I'm sure there are other things you can discuss and other ways that chess relates to music. But for me, again, it's like an improvised jazz solo because it's that mix of known theory and creativity. This is definitely a fascinating discussion, and it's something I might pursue as a standalone episode. So I really appreciate your email, Matthew, and good luck with your chess journey. Our next email is from Jeffrey. He writes, longtime listener from Cincinnati, Ohio, currently sitting in the Skittles room of a tournament after going 0-1. LOL. The only tournaments near me that I can make it to are quads, so there's only 3 rounds. Do you have any advice on how to shake off tournament losses? If after 1 round I'm 0-1, I've noticed there's a good chance I go 0-3. So it's hard to shake it off and prepare for my next match. I really appreciate the podcast. Thanks for everything. Great question, Jeff. Really appreciate the email. Shout out to our listeners in Ohio. And yet, losing stinks. Okay? It really does. And I'm not going to give the sort of like ooey gooey new age, let's all hug a tree type of answer, which would be something like, well, we have to learn from our tournament losses, and it's about the experience, and you're meeting new people, and I just enjoy going to tournaments. It's such a worthwhile activity, and even all the great players lost games, and learning is part of the growth process. And when you lose a game, you should just own it and all this yada, yada, yada. Okay, I'm going to yak. Losing stinks, and all those platitudes really aren't going to help. Sorry for like the tough love answer, but most of you listen to this podcast, I think, anyway, in part because I kind of say it like it is. And in my opinion, maybe this is a little harsh, some people might disagree, but all of these platitudes we hear about, like, owning the loss and how it's part of the game, which is true, it doesn't really help move the needle forward. It's just sort of a security blanket to make us feel better after we lose. But I don't know that it helps. And if you really get into that whole thing, if you rationalize the losses too much, then you get into this cycle where it's just going to be like, oh, well, it's okay. And you're going to lose even more. The best way to deal with a tournament loss, as far as I'm concerned now, if there's something else out there that works, somebody tell me, because I haven't figured it out yet. But for me, the best thing to do, the best cure after a really tough loss is to win your next game. That'll mitigate it at least 80%. Just win your next game. Don't get into a situation where you're bringing the loss home with you, or if it's a weekly club game, you're thinking about it like at work the next day and stuff. You don't want to get into that type of headspace. Now, in your situation where you have one game after the other, that's a great point, Jeffrey. And it's one of the reasons for me personally, I'm just going to open up a little bit here. I generally don't play in those weekend events for that reason, because I know, like I try to be honest about my flaws. I know that I will tilt. All right. If I lose, let's say I lose in round one, and especially if it's like a lower rated player or something, and I just get upset, let's say, or even if it's not a lower rated player, let's just say I have a stinker of a game in round one. For me, it is very, very hard to shake that off, shake off the emotional baggage from that loss, and then like 20 minutes later, play another game. That's very, very difficult to do. In a way, it's not normal to do that because humans don't work that way. And one of the nice things about playing in a weekly club is that you have a week to shake it off. So if I had a bad loss at the club, I can move on. And, by the time I show up next week, it's done. So tilting is not really as prevalent at the club level where you're playing once a week. But in these weekend tournaments, it's tough. And I really don't have like a magic formula. Well, every time you lose, Jeff, do this, this, and this. Just do your best to just win your next game. And don't get into a situation where you're trying to force the win. Just play your normal game, get the point, and then if you go 1-1, at least you'll feel a little bit better. That's really the only thing that seems to help. But I get it. For example, I just started playing again at the club after completing my degree. Meaning, I said that wrong, meaning it was my first game at the club after completing my degree, my first tournament. And I'm still, kind of getting back into the groove because my study plan was kind of shot. I was working on a graduate degree, took a lot away. So I'm kind of slowly getting my mojo back, kind of getting the momentum back into playing with a little bit of a clearer head and trying to study more. But here's my point. In round one, I drew the top seed. I think he was almost 1,900. He was like an 1889 player. So I was really happy with that. It was a draw. And then in round two, I lose to a 1,600. And it was really frustrating. I shouldn't be losing to 1,600 players, but that's what happened. And of course, all these things go through your head, right? You're losing rating points. Any rating points I gained from drawing that, 1889 player is now shot. And then I'm thinking I'm now going to get a lousy pairing in the next round. It's the whole thing. But at the club level, at least I have the week to kind of shake it off and then go on to win my next game. Now, of course, I had to take a bye the following week. So that's how it goes. I had a family commitment. But what I'm trying to say is, I understand your pain and how frustrating those losses are. So again, just to recap two things. I think a lot of the platitudes about losing games just really don't help, and they just sort of rationalize. And you need to be careful of that stuff because all those little things like, write down about your loss in a journal and all this other thing. See, this is just me. Some people are going to really disagree and say, no, that helps me. That's fine. I'm just saying for me, I know for a lot of people, all of that sort of new age, ooey gooey, become one with the loss type of thing, it's not really going to help. Just win your next game. And also understand, I will say this much, you're not going to win every game. Like we at the club level especially, we need to accept that you're not going to win every game. It doesn't matter how much you study, how much you prepare. That's just how tournament chess is. Yes, let's try to minimize those losses as much as possible, but you just have to accept you're not going to win every game. And the way I look at it, what helps me is I look at the tournament as a whole. I don't worry about individual losses. My whole thing is if I end a tournament and I ended up with more rating points than when I started, even if it's just like 5 or 6 points, in my view, that was a successful tournament because the amateur chess scene is just so much more difficult and much more competitive now. I look at it that way. So that's something that helps me as well. So maybe I had a really embarrassing loss, but I ended up gaining 10 points on the entire tournament. I would look at it that way. Look at the big picture. Don't get too caught up in individual losses. I will say this, Jeffrey, I do not have a specific thing or a formula to help you deal with a loss. I really don't. I think those weekend Swisses where it's one game after the other are very difficult. especially if you don't start out well. Now, the people who start out, let's say 0-2, and then they go back and win like 3 games in a row, I really give them a lot of credit because that takes a lot of inner fortitude and mental stamina. I probably don't have that. It's one of the reasons I generally don't play in weekend Swisses. If I went back to a weekend Swiss, I would probably do a seniors tournament because I'm over 50 now. I'm a young over 50. No, but I'm over 50 now. And the idea of playing in a seniors tournament I like because there's no kids. There's probably not as much rating deflation because everyone's been playing for a long time. So, I mean, I would think anyway. But if I were to do that, again, play on weekends, I would probably do a seniors tournament. That's something I'm looking into. But I really am more of a club person as far as 1 game a week. And a large part of that is for the reasons I detailed, is because if I do have a bad night, I have a week to shake it off. I can analyze the game. And then when I go to the following game a week later, I'm in a good headspace. Whereas having to play another slow game only 20 minutes after a tough loss, I mean, that's rough. That's tough to do. Those are my thoughts on that. So it's the way I sign out every podcast, right? I hope you win your next game. That's what I wish for you, Jeffrey. That's really the only cure. And just understand we're not going to win every game. But I know when you lose the first game, there's something, it's like a mental thing where it sort of sets the tone for the rest of the tournament. And it's mentally, you feel like you're playing catch up. I get it. It's tough to deal with. It's just one of those things when you're dealing with a quad or a weekend Swiss where there's a lot of games. But I've been there, Jeffrey. I feel your pain. Hang in there. And I hope you win your next game, Jeffrey, all right? Because it'll help. Thank you so much for your email. Our final email comes from Xavier. He says, hello, my name is Xavier. I'm 21 and I live in Missouri. I recently got back into chess, which I haven't played since I was in high school. When I played it, it was only occasionally, never in a club. I have loved listening to your podcast, and soon I will look into joining a chess club near me and hopefully play in tournaments. Your book recommendations and your insights to the chess world really have helped me a lot on my journey to improve. My question is, sometimes I notice whenever I get angry or frustrated in the game and start to play quicker and more aggressively, I do really well, almost better than when I have been playing patiently and trying to plan. I was wondering if you have ran into this and how I could try to incorporate this into my usual play style. Thank you again for the podcast. Keep up the great work, Xavier. Well, first, Xavier, I really appreciate the kind words about the podcast. It really means a lot. Whenever I hear that, it's very humbling. I take that very seriously. So really appreciate you listening to the pod. Now, your email's interesting. My knee-jerk response is that I would have to see your game to kind of really understand what you're talking about, because generally that's probably not a good thing. Like if you're getting angry or frustrated and then you start playing quicker and aggressively, that's generally a great way to lose the game. But you're saying it's helping you. So I'm not sure if it's your opponents. I'm not sure what their strength is. I'm not sure if maybe you have a good attacking style. But when you say more aggressively, like I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean you're making, very unsound moves and attacks, or are you just kind of attacking in a sound way when it's warranted? Hard to really know, but I would say this without actually meeting you or actually seeing your games, without a chessboard in front of me, I would say to just be very careful with that, because as you play stronger players, that sort of lashing out can cause problems. Now, when you say you're playing quicker and more aggressively, if you're doing so in a responsible way or in a sound way where it's theoretically called for, where the position calls for an attack, or if the position allows for an attack, that's fine. But I don't know if you mean you're just kind of like shoving your pieces towards your opponent's king. I don't know if you're getting lucky. I don't know if maybe you are an aggressive player. If so, I mean, if what you're doing is sound, then you may want to look into some more aggressive openings. It's hard for me to discuss that because I'm the complete opposite. I tend to be more of a slow, grindy type of positional player. And if I try to get too aggressive, if I get frustrated, that's a great way to lose the game. I certainly can play an attacking style, and I've done that. It's not my favorite. I can be very tactical, but I usually only go down that road if the position calls for it. Like, just as a very basic example, everybody knows I play the London. The London can be played very quietly. It can be played very aggressively. And there are times where I've left my king in the center and I'll push h4, but that's because the position calls for it. My knight is locked in on e5. I have control of the center. I can maybe safely castle queenside, and a kingside attack is warranted because my opponent castled kingside. And, if he can't get a knight on f6, especially, like a bishop sacrifice might be in play. But I only play aggressively, and I would advise this to anybody. You only want to play aggressively or attack if the position calls for it. So again, without seeing your game, it's tricky to really give a concrete answer. But as far as incorporating that style into your play, you may want to look into some of these gambit openings or some of these more aggressive openings. Not that I really recommend those, and not that I'm really a fan of those, but if that's your style and you enjoy it and you seem to be achieving some success, it's something you can look into. But I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning of this, which is just be very careful about getting frustrated and lashing out, because against stronger players, they're going to eat you alive. They're going to take advantage of that, right? They're going to see that you're overpressing. They're going to find that one mistake. Against maybe weaker players, you can probably get away with that. Again, I'm sorry if this answer was a little bit vague, but without actually seeing the game, it's kind of tricky to really tell you what to do. All right. But again, there are certain openings that you can look into, certain gambit openings that might work well if you prefer that type of style, because that sort of patient, grindy type of style, it's not for everybody. So I hope that helps, Xavier. And again, thanks so much for your email. All right, so I would now like to discuss chess mindsets, specifically your attitude at the board. A lot of these will have to do with playing higher rated opponents, but not necessarily, but that's generally what I'm going to focus on, because that's usually where our headspace can get a little off kilter. And I'm also gearing this for people who are probably a little bit newer to tournaments, although for those of us who've been around a while, I still think this discussion will be relevant. Just some things to think about. Some of these I may have mentioned, but it's worth reviewing. A lot of chess psychology here. So one mindset that's very common, especially when we play a higher rated opponent, is the idea that every move they make is some type of major threat or a mate threat or some type of major thematic idea. And a lot of this has to do with the psychology of playing higher rated opponents. Now, Silman, I believe it was in The Amateur's Mind, he talks about how people win because of the rating system. He talks about how a win is a victory for the rating system. And what he means is, if, for example, a 1400 player is facing a 1900 player, right away, certain things go through the 1400 player's mind. He's thinking, well, this guy's 1900. He must be amazing, right? He's not going to make any mistakes. And every move he makes, I'm going to have to be careful. And then what happens is, and Silman talks about this, right? The moves become a little slower, a little more hesitant. You give your opponent way too much credit and you just fall apart. And it really is the type of thing where you've lost the game before it's even started. And that's why Silman calls it a win for the rating system, because simply by looking at the opponent's high rating, you're already lost, right? You already have this idea that you can't win and that you're playing some type of perfect machine, and you're not. And it's true. And I always wondered, as an experiment, if, let's say, a 1200 player were given a rating of 1900, like let's say on the pairing charts, right, on the wall chart, instead of his 1200 rating, it was listed as 1900 and he was playing low rated opponents. I'm very curious if that alone would give him an edge, because it's true. We look at the number and automatically we do this sort of mental chess gymnastics about what the game should be, right? So if you're 1400, using that example, if you're 1400 and your opponent is, say, 1800, right away, right, you have a certain idea in your head. But if you're 1400 and your opponent is 800, all of a sudden you're thinking, it might be, easier game. He's 800, right? And it's almost like you're a little bit excited, and it's quite remarkable how that works. But that's what Silman means about a win for the rating system, because we create all these ideas in our head and we sort of psych ourselves out. We basically get in our own way. But the idea that every move that your higher rated opponent makes is a major threat is simply not true. And as I've mentioned before, if you put your game in an engine against a higher rated opponent, you would be amazed at how many mistakes they make. I'm not talking about hanging pieces, but just basic mistakes, things that they missed, opportunities that they missed. All right, they're not perfect. They make mistakes. And if you automatically assume that your higher rated opponent is threatening mate on every move, you're never going to win the game and you're never going to do well. The other idea is that you think your opponent will never blunder. And that can be a way to miss opportunities as well, because they might make a mistake and you can maybe win a pawn or something and you're thinking, no, that's got to be a trap. But you need to analyze it. And if it was a mistake, you have to go for it. But a lot of people are afraid to do that. They don't trust their own analysis. Well, I'm analyzing it and I can clearly win a pawn. I'm looking at this 4, 5, 6 times. There's no tactics. There's no trap. But what happens? You're afraid to pull the trigger and grab that pawn because you're convinced that there's some type of trap that you're not seeing because your opponent is so much higher rated. And then as a result, you don't play it and then they go on to win. Whereas if you had taken that pawn, you might have drawn or even won the game. The next mindset that can be very insidious is the idea that you don't feel prepared for your game because you didn't really study or play that much, that week. This is going out to those of us who work full time, right? We're living in the real world. We have a day job. Chess is really a hobby for us. It's one we take very seriously. I don't know, hobby might not be the right word because it's more than that, but you get the idea. And I go through this sometimes myself where I'll have weeks, and this was especially true the past few years while I was in grad school, where I'll show up to the club, right? I spoke to National Master Nick Panico about this when he was on the pod. I'll show up to the club and I barely looked at a chessboard that week and I'm about to play a game. And you have to learn to just block that out, because even if that's true, you can still win the game. Your opponent's human. He or she is going to be tired. They have other issues as well. And you can't just assume that you're going to lose the game just because you didn't play that much that week. Just get over it. Don't think about it and don't set yourself up for failure. And that's one of the reasons why I'm an advocate of having a set opening repertoire and sticking to it, because you can rely on that when you do have those weeks where you didn't get to study much or really play much. You can fall back on that. You don't have to worry, well, I didn't go over my openings. That's one of the reasons why I like thematic openings and not theoretical ones, because when you do have those sort of dry spells where you're not studying, you can still get through it. So that's something to think about there. Along those lines, and this is something I go through as well, you think, well, I'm going to lose the game because I'm just exhausted right now. I'm not 100%. And my answer to that is the following, because I struggled with this for a long time. You have to accept the fact, you meaning as someone like myself who's working full time, has a family, who's doing this on the side, so to speak, you're never going to be 100% at the club. You have to accept that. And it took me a long time to figure it out, because I was like, why am I so tired? What can I do? And then I'm like, Neal, what is wrong with you? You're never going to be 100%. That's just how it is. Club games, right? Your weekly club game, by definition, is going to be very ugly. Okay? Because you're not going to be 100%. For the most part, your opponent is not going to be 100% as well, because they're working as well. I mean, we have guys at the club, right? The games start at 7:30. I mean, they're waltzing in straight from work at like 7:20, 7:25. I mean, there's no downtime, right? Because we have guys, 9 to 5 in it. They're coming from the city. They're taking trains or whatever. Or even if they're working on the island, even if they're local and they're just driving to work. By the time they get out of work, have dinner, everyone's in the same situation for the most part. I mean, sure, you have your retirees. You have, some of the younger kids who might have a little bit of downtime, although I think some of these kids nowadays, their schedules are busier than ours, but you get the idea. Everyone's in the same situation, and You just need to get over that. Well, I'm going to lose because I'm exhausted. I'm not 100%. Who is, right? Who is? That's what club level games are by definition. And I know that I'm going to miss little things here and there for that reason. And again, the goal is you just need to miss, less than your opponent does, right? It's the old James Altucher analogy when he was on the pod, right? If a bear is chasing a crowd, it's not about whether you can outrun the bear, it's whether you can outrun the other people who are running from the bear. So you might be off, but if your opponent is more off, so we're all tired. The games are going to be ugly. They're not going to be perfect. And that's just how it is, because that's a very specific sort of situation and skill set, is playing at night after a full day of work, right? The human brain only has so much mental power. It can focus at its top level, only so much per day. I mean, I read something somewhere, I think like the human brain can only perform at its peak like a maximum of like 6 hours a day or something like that. So if you had a tough day at work, it's hard. It's hard playing at night, but you need to get over that and not make excuses. Next thing, and this is a big one, is where you get frustrated and you think your position is worse because your opponent is moving very quickly. Now, for me, and I've said this, that is really annoying. I'm going to be honest. When I have an opponent who, in say a 90-minute game, is playing like it's a 5-minute blitz game, it's really annoying. I'm not going to mince words. It's annoying. In fact, one time, and this was wrong, don't do this. This was, I don't know what came over me. One time my opponent was doing it, and I actually turned to him and I said, like, do you have to catch a plane or something? Like, why, and it was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. It was a moment of frustration, but, I'm just trying to be honest, like how annoying that is. So I guess if you're playing me, move fast. If you want to annoy me, no. But all kidding aside, it's really, really frustrating when you're playing a classical game and your opponent is not only blitzing out moves, but he's right there in the game. He's blitzing out these moves and yet has a great position. It's really frustrating, but that could be for several reasons. Number one, it could be that they're coming from the internet. They're just used to playing fast. Number two, it could be a position or opening that they're familiar with. And number three, it is a tactic that some people use where they'll say, I'm going to play as fast as I can if I understand a position, and I'm going to hopefully, frustrate this guy. But when that happens, two things. First of all, don't assume that you're worse, because you might think, well, if he's moving so fast, I must be playing terribly. My position is horrible. No, that's just how people play. And the second thing is, don't get frustrated and then match your opponent. We talked about matching in a previous episode when I spoke of common mistakes. When your opponent keeps moving quickly, move after move after move, eventually he or she is going to make one fast move too many, and you can capitalize on it. So just wait them out. It's kind of like playing an aggressive player in poker. Just wait them out and pick your spot. All right. But I know how really, really annoying that can be when they move so fast. But look at it this way. Instead of getting frustrated by it, say, okay, they're moving quickly. That's going to come to my advantage because there's going to be that one position where you're going to have some type of threat. They're going to miss it, but don't let it get to you. And most important, don't assume that you're worse or that you're losing just because your opponent is playing quickly. Go by the position. Next thing, and this one is big, never expect or hope for an easy game. You need to commit to the game. It's very easy to say, okay, I'm 1,800. Oh, my opponent's 1,200. Oh, this is going to be an easy game. I can go home and, watch the football game. No. That is a very, very dangerous mindset to get into. Never, ever, ever expect or hope for an easy game, because it's a lower rated player like that, where if you take that attitude and you're like, oh, he's going to hang something, or he's going to drop a pawn, and they don't, that's a great way to lose the game. And I know when you're tired and it's been a long day, maybe you have something the next morning and, you want to get home early, or maybe there's something at home you're dealing with, that type of thing. Maybe you're a little bit distracted. Oh, cool. Quick game tonight. Don't go there. Never expect an easy game. You have to start your game expecting that it's going to be a battle. Now, if it does go short, if it is a quick game, your opponent drops something on move 5, whatever, you checkmate him after, fine. You got an early night. You can go home and do what you want. But don't hope for that or expect it, because that's going to affect your play. You're going to be sloppy. You're going to underestimate your opponent's threats or not even see them. And it's a lower rated opponent like that, where you take that attitude that, I hope I have a quick game tonight, or I don't think it's going to be that challenging of a game. That's where you get into trouble. Absolutely. That's like the worst mindset that you can have. On this entire list, that might be the biggest one, right? Where you sort of expect or hope for an easy game. And obviously, if you're playing a much lower rated opponent, you can get into that mindset. And I'm going to repeat what I've said several times on this podcast. I know for me anyway, it is much more mentally demanding and taxing playing a lower rated opponent than a higher rated one. I will argue that to the hilt. Is that an expression, to the hilt? I don't know. I need to buy like a book like Common Expressions and Phrases for Dummies or something. I always mess these up. I think it's to the hilt. I don't know. I had a professor who always used to use that phrase. Anyway, I digress. The thing is, when you play a higher rated opponent, it actually favors the lower rated opponent mentally. What I mean is there's no real ego issue or anything because you're expected statistically to lose. And if you do lose, your rating is going to take a minimal hit. But if you win, you get a ton of rating points. And if you draw, you also get rating points, right? Draw odds, we spoke about that. So there's really no pressure. And regardless of the result, you're presumably going to get an instructive game out of it. But when you play a lower rated player, there's literally zero benefit. There really is. I don't mean that in an elitist way. That's not a knock on lower rated players, not at all. But I'm just saying mathematically from a ratings standpoint, right? From a ratings standpoint, there's no benefit because if you beat a lower rated opponent, and when I say lower rated, I'm saying like at least 200 points lower, not like 10 points lower, right? A significantly lower rated opponent, if you win, it's like whoop-de-doo. What do you get, 5-6 points? If you draw, you're going to lose points, not a ton, but you're going to take a hit. And if you lose, you're going to take a huge hit. That's where you can lose like 20 points or more, which is brutal. And then not only do you lose against the low-rated opponent, guess what? You now get a lousy pairing in the next round, and it might be another 2 rounds or so before you get a decent pairing again. And so you're playing catch-up, and that's where tilt can happen. That's what I spoke about in the mail segment, right, about those weekend quads where, he went 0-1. You get into that whole thing. And now if it were up to me, I mean, obviously this can't happen, but I was speaking with a friend, Kyle Grasser. Shout out to Kyle. I don't know if he listens to the pod. He used to come to the club all the time, and we had a great conversation about this. And I like what Kyle said. He goes, in any tournament, let's say it's a 5-round tournament, he goes, I would want to play the top 5 guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no matter how I do. I agree 100%. I agree 100%. It can be frustrating playing low-rated opponents, right? Because you're looking forward to your game all week. It's such a great activity. It's a release. I'm all psyched to play, and you find out your opponent is, like 1,100. And it's like, all right, it does get frustrating, and that's part of it. But I think there's a lot more pressure playing lower-rated than higher-rated because there's just so much benefit to playing a high-rated opponent, and there's not much benefit to playing a low-rated opponent. But that's just how it is nowadays. We have a lot more people coming to the club. We have a lot more people getting involved in tournaments. And so that sort of unrated up to about 1,200 rating range is now very common because you have a lot of people coming into the game. But if you're really looking to boost your rating, if you're, say, rated above 1,400, it's tough to increase your rating because of that. That's why, some people are not playing at the club level. They'd rather play on the weekend where there's higher rated competition. I mean, the guy who won the last tournament, he went 5-0, and I think he only got something like maybe 30 points total, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, 30 points is a lot, but you would think if you went 5-0, you would get a lot more than 30 points. But because his competition was much lower rated, that's what happens. So a lot of psychology there. But the whole point is I kind of went in a circle there a little bit. Never expect or hope for an easy game, regardless or irregardless, as my Aunt Teresa used to say, regardless of your opponent's rating, expect a battle. That's the right mindset. And it's very easy to slip into, the idea of that, oh, this might be a quick game tonight. Don't go there because that's the best way to lose the game. This next mindset has to do with preparation. or quote unquote preparing for your opponent. Okay. Now I'm laughing here. Okay. This is just my opinion. At the amateur level, at the club level, the idea of quote unquote prepping for your opponent is like the dumbest thing on the planet. Okay. We're at the club level, people. I prepare for my opponent. You're not Magnus like playing in the world championship. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute, why would you say that? That sounds a little ridiculous, because at the amateur level, it's almost never going to follow the book line. All right. I mean, I'm not saying like don't ever prepare for your opponent, but what happens is more often than not is that you work on this variation because let's say your opponent plays a certain opening. Oh, I'm going to hit him with this variation. Yeah, but what happens is they end up doing something else, or they end up not playing the opening you were expecting. And then you get frustrated and you're like, wait a minute, but I spent all this time this week. And then you try to force your opening in a position that doesn't call for it. And you end up getting a worse position because you're, making things contrived and you're forcing things where it doesn't belong. And then you lose the game. Whereas if you don't prepare for your opponent in the first place, that wouldn't happen. Now, when I say prepare for your opponent, I'm talking about a specific opening line. Because let's face it, the rule is at the club level, they almost never go into that line. I mean, let's keep it real. Now, if you're rated, say, 2,000 and you're facing another 2,000 rated opponent, then maybe we can talk about preparation. But I'm talking about for your typical club level game in the, let's say, below 1,600 range, the idea of preparing for your opponent makes no sense. You're better off just studying chess in general, playing a little bit, working on tactics, working on strategy. You can study your openings in the general sense. But the idea is when you have this like quote unquote special line ready, the problem with that is your opponent has to play along, right? That's the problem with sort of memorizing openings in general. Like what I mentioned in the beginning during the email segment when I was talking about one of the letter writers, I forgot his name, where he was talking about memorizing openings. That's one of the problems, which is with these memorized lines, your opponent has to play along. What if he doesn't play whatever, knight F6 on move 4 like he's supposed to? Oh, well, what do I do now? That's the problem with preparation. That's why you need to understand the themes and the ideas. The ultimate problem with this, here's where I'm going with this, is you say, well, I prepared for my opponent. You start to think, well, I hope he plays this variation that I worked on, or I expect him to play this variation. Well, guess what? What if he doesn't? Most players, they're going to get frustrated and try to force things, but you need to be able to pivot from that. Whereas if you didn't prepare and hope for this one specific line, you'll be more flexible. So this is just me. I think the whole idea of preparing for an opponent at the club level is overrated because I went through a phase where I would try to do that. Like, in other words, if it were later in the tournament and I knew I was only going to play, say, one of two players, oh, I'm going to prepare this for this guy and this, and they would end up going in a completely different direction. And then what happens is you then feel frustrated because you spent all this time on this variation that you now can't use. And then that's going to affect your game. That's going to affect your headspace. So I really do feel the idea of preparing for your opponent at this level is overrated. And I think what happens is we hear all the top GMs talk about preparing for their opponents and opening preparation. But at the GM level, that's a whole different scene. They kind of have to do that. It's completely different. But what they deal with doesn't apply to what we're dealing with. So I think the idea of, I have to be prepared for my opponent and I hope he plays this variation, that's going to get you into trouble. All right, before we close this out, there are two more things I want to discuss. I know this is very like stream of consciousness a little bit, this episode, but that's okay. This is important stuff, I think. Hopefully you find it helpful. Do not fall into the let me try this mindset. Very, very dangerous. Oh, let me try this. In fact, we had at the club last night, I'm not making this up. We have at the club, what I call announcers. That's where they make a move and then they like provide commentary, which you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to talk during the game. The only talking during the game should be like to resign or offer a draw. So he makes this move and he goes, let me try this. And, I didn't say anything. I mean, because he stopped after, but you're not really supposed to talk during the game. It was actually kind of funny, but he ended up losing the game. If you're saying to yourself, let me try this, it's probably not a good move. All right. You need to know why you're playing it, at least on some level. if you're playing and you're like, let me try this. Like, I'm not sure if this is going to work. It's probably not a good idea. Don't get into the let me try this mindset. Now, I know if you're in time pressure or it's a position that's tough, it can do this. I mean, now you could say, let me try this, but you've analyzed it and you're not sure if it's the best move, but you see that it's sound. But you don't want to do where it's let me try this and you're just kind of like blindly moving the piece. All right. Let me try this is not a good place to be. You need to know why you're playing the move. Even if you're not fully sure about the position, you need to blunder check it. You need to play it with some type of idea. There should be some type of reason why you're playing it. But to sort of, let me try this, like I'm not sure if this is right, don't go there. But it's very, very common. I mean, it was kind of funny when he did this the other night. I did have to laugh. What was it, 2 nights ago, whatever it was? You don't want to get into that mindset. Now, the other thing is, you also have to be careful about theory and principles versus what's actually happening in the position. Good players know, and this is a big thing that separates stronger players from weaker ones. Good players know when they need to quote unquote violate chess principles because the position calls for it. For example, many tactical shots that win material or win the game actually violate theory, especially early in the game. You ever notice those tactical shots early in the game? The winning move usually violates some type of principle. For example, it might involve moving the same piece twice in the opening. But guess what? When you move your knight again, it wins a piece or it wins a pawn. Or it might involve moving your queen too early. Yes, but when you do make this early queen move, it's going to lead to a winning position, right? You ever notice that? So you need to be careful about chess principles versus what the position calls for. And again, many of those winning tactical shots actually violate or seem to violate some type of positional idea, but the benefit you're gaining negates the drawbacks of it, so to speak. And so I just spoke about the let me try this mindset. The other mindset that's dangerous is the, well, I'm supposed to do this, right? According to theory, I'm supposed to do this or I'm not supposed to do this, right? I'm not supposed to move my knight on the rim because knights on the rim are dim. Yeah, but what you don't realize, by moving your knight, you're now threatening a pawn fork or something. Or by moving your knight to the side, you're now going to reposition it somewhere else where he's not going to be able to kick it away. That type of thing. And even strong players go through that where you're so focused on the theory and the principles, but in this particular position, it's actually correct to violate those because it's correct. And that's why all these like positional ideas and rules, you have to take them as general principles, not something to be used literally all the time. Because again, many times the winning move or the winning idea, it sounds counterintuitive, but a lot of the time the winning idea sort of goes against traditional theory. It could be where, leaving your king in the middle is actually correct in some cases. It could be that moving one of your castling pawns is actually the correct move. I had a game where my opponent is very common at the amateur level. He had 2 pieces on a file. They were separated by 1 file, and I had a pawn fork, and I won a piece. But remember, every book we ever read, right? Don't move your castling pawns. If you get so stuck in that, I might not have seen the tactic, because what happened was, it's I take, and then he takes back. If he doesn't take back, he's down material. So I take, he takes back, pawn fork. Very, very common. But to do it, I had to move a castling pawn. Now, yeah, I checked that. He didn't have any threats against my king. But if I were so caught up in the rules that, you never move your castling pawns, I would not have seen this tactic and this idea. And there are also positional ideas that involve moving your castling pawns. It could be the H pawn. So to close out this segment, again, be very careful of the, let me try this when making a move. Not a good idea. And also be careful of the, I'm supposed to do this or I'm not supposed to do this according to chess theory. You have to go by the particular position and analyze the actual moves. That's something that GM Danny Gormley was talking about. It's a big problem among amateurs. We're so focused on sort of the rules and principles, but, actually look at the moves. Like if you do this, what does he have? What's the follow-up? Look at the actual moves, calculate, all right? And then worry about, the chess principles. Because like I said, a lot of these winning moves seem to violate sort of a known positional idea. So that's going to do it for this week. As always, we really appreciate you listening. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're enjoying the podcast, we would really appreciate it if you would tell a friend and leave us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. Many of you have already, and we really appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter, or X as they now call it, at The Chess Angle. If you're interested in supporting the pod, you can check out our Patreon page for recurring support, very low monthly fee. Or if you want to just kind of do a one and done type of thing, you can check out our Buy Me a Coffee page if that's something that interests you. There are links for all this stuff in the show notes. And as a reminder, everyone is invited to email me if you have a question or a topic idea for a future episode. We really like that. It helps drive the podcast and the content. And if there's a topic that you're interested in, chances are other people are as well. It's kind of like I tell the kids, if you have a question, ask it, because 99% of the class is probably thinking the same thing. You do not need to be a Patreon member to ask questions. That's open to everybody. The email is info@thechessangle.com. There's always a link for that in the show notes. And as always, I can't promise that your question or topic idea will be used, but I'll definitely take a look at everything that comes my way. Really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.